It was May 23, 1941. The crystal-clear blue waters of the Mediterranean were witnessing a destroyer's final breath. As German Stuka dive bombers filled the sky, the men on deck felt death's cold breath on the back of their necks. But this was no ordinary ship. This ship had struck mines, been riddled by torpedoes, clashed with E-boats and bombers, and every time it should have sunk, it didn't. This ship was HMS Kelly, and today, we're going to tell her story. If you love the most dramatic naval stories of World War II, this video is for you. Because the story of HMS Kelly isn't just about a warship, it's about a spirit that refused to sink, a crew that never gave up, and one of history's most charismatic captains. Every legend has a beginning. HMS Kelly's story started in Hebburn in northeastern England at the Hawthorne-Leslie shipyards. When her keel was laid down on August 26, 1937, no one could have imagined this ship would become home to one of the most unforgettable stories in naval history. Kelly was the flotilla leader of the K-class destroyers. At 356 feet long, displacing 2,330 tons, and capable of reaching 36 knots, this steel giant was armed with 6 4.7-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. But what made Kelly special wasn't just her specifications. What truly set her apart was the man who would stand on her bridge, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, second cousin to King George V. A man with aristocratic blood, but a sailor's soul. Mountbatten took command of Kelly on August 23, 1939, just 11 days before Britain declared war on Germany. From that moment on, captain and ship were bound by fate. One of Kelly's first missions carried deeply symbolic meaning in the early days of the war. In September 1939, Mountbatten received special orders: bring the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the abdicated King Edward VIII, and Wallis Simpson, back to England from their exile in France. The order came directly from the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Kelly safely transported the Royals, completing her first mission, but the real tests were yet to come. December 14, 1939. Kelly was escorting rescue tugs at the mouth of the River Tyne. They were unaware of a minefield laid by German destroyers. Then came the explosion. A magnetic mine detonated near Kelly's stern. The hull buckled. The damage was serious. But Kelly didn't sink. HMS Mohawk came to assist and towed the damaged ship back to Hawthorne-Leslie for repairs. After 3 months of repairs, Kelly returned to sea. But fate had other plans. On March 2, 1940, just 2 days after leaving the shipyard, Kelly collided with HMS Gurkha during a heavy snowstorm. Gurkha's propeller tore a 100-foot gash in Kelly's hull. The freezing waters of the North Sea began flooding in. Once again, Kelly was on the brink of sinking. And once again, she didn't. Another 8 weeks of repairs, but Kelly refused to give up. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Allied forces launched counter-operations, and Kelly joined the mission to evacuate British and French troops from Namsos. On the night of May 1, 1940, Kelly entered the Namsen Fjord and was the first ship to reach the stone pier. 270 French soldiers quickly boarded. Under the cover of darkness, beneath the shadow of Stuka bombers, Kelly completed her mission. But the real disaster came on the night of May 9th to 10th. Kelly was patrolling the North Sea. Around midnight, the German E-boat S-31, under the command of Oberleutnant Hermann Optenhoff, emerged from the darkness and attacked. The torpedo struck Kelly dead center, right in the boiler room. The explosion was so violent that the hole nearly stretched from the keel to the upper deck. Both boiler rooms flooded. Any other ship would have sunk within minutes, but Kelly was not any other ship. Mountbatten sprang into action. Everything on deck was thrown overboard to lighten the load. The crew was forced to believe they were on a ship that would survive, not one that was sinking. HMS Bulldog arrived to help and took Kelly under tow. Then the tugboat Great Emperor took over. For 4 days, at just 3 knots, Kelly was dragged toward port.
And for 4 days, German E-boats and bombers attacked relentlessly. But Kelly's crew refused to surrender. Gunners stayed at their stations. Engineers kept pumping water. 91 hours later, Kelly reached the River Tyne. The controller of the Navy would later write in his official report, Kelly was saved not only by the exceptional seamanship of her officers and men, but also by the excellent workmanship that ensured the watertight integrity of other compartments. A single faulty rivet could have been her end. Kelly was towed back to the shipyard once more. This time, repairs took months. Over a 14-month period, Kelly had spent only 2 weeks on active duty. But Mountbatten's faith in his men never wavered. He didn't see his ship as a heap of metal. Kelly was a living being, a family. In December 1940, repairs were finally complete. Kelly set sail again with new equipment and renewed spirit. This time, the destination was the Mediterranean. Malta, Crete, North Africa. The war's fiercest fronts awaited Kelly. But know this, her story doesn't end here. In fact, the most dramatic chapters were just beginning. The Battle of Crete, an attack by 24 Stukas at once, Mountbatten standing on the bridge until the very last moment, and that unforgettable line that went down in history. I'll tell you all of that in Part 2. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you don't want to miss the continuation of HMS Kelly's epic journey, hit the notification bell too. Because in the next episode, you'll witness this invincible destroyer's greatest test and her crew's incredible courage. Now, let's dive deep.
In Part 1, I told you how HMS Kelly struck mines, was hit by a torpedo, collided with another destroyer, and refused to sink every single time. Now, I'm going to tell you about this legendary ship's final days in the Mediterranean, the hell of the Battle of Crete, and that last fight that went down in history. If you haven't watched Part 1, I strongly recommend you watch it first, because to fully grasp this story, you need to know Kelly's past. If you're ready, let's set sail for the spring of 1941, into the bloody waters of the Mediterranean. After completing repairs in December 1940, HMS Kelly undertook sea trials and brief assignments in the English Channel. But the real destination was clear, the Mediterranean. This sea, one of the war's most critical theaters, was the lifeline of the British Empire. Egypt, the Suez Canal, Malta. All these strategic points depended on control of the Mediterranean. In April 1941, Kelly and the 5th Destroyer Flotilla reached Gibraltar. There, alongside HMS Abdiel, HMS Dio, HMS Jackal, HMS Jersey, HMS Kashmir, HMS Kelvin, and HMS Kipling, they formed a special unit called Force S. Their mission was to escort reinforcements to the Mediterranean fleet. On April 28th, the flotilla arrived at Malta. Kelly was now in the hottest zone of the war, attacking Axis convoys bound for North Africa, defending Malta, escorting Allied ships. The duties were heavy, the dangers immense. A new chapter was opening for Mountbatten and his men. They had transitioned from the cold waters of the North Sea to the scorching sun of the Mediterranean. But the enemy hadn't changed. The German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Marina were doing everything to establish absolute dominance in these waters. Malta was a small island nation in the heart of the Mediterranean, of vital strategic importance. Indispensable for the British, it was a target the Germans and Italians desperately needed to capture. The island was under constant air attack. Harbors were bombed. Civilians lived in shelters. During her time stationed at Malta, Kelly was in danger almost every day. Even the harbor wasn't safe. German junkers, U-87 Stukas, and Italian bombers targeted ships in port. The crew had to remain alert even while docked. But Kelly didn't just stay on the defensive. As part of Force K, she launched attacks on Axis convoys carrying supplies to North Africa. These operations were extremely dangerous. The Mediterranean's clear waters were ideal hunting grounds for submarines and torpedo boats. Moreover, the Luftwaffe had absolute air superiority over the sea. On May 8, 1941, HMS Jersey struck a magnetic mine while leaving Malta Harbor and sunk.
Another of Kelly's flotilla mates had been lost, but the war didn't stop. After Jersey's wreckage was cleared, the flotilla put to sea again. On May 10th, Kelly, along with other destroyers, bombarded the port of Benghazi. This was a raid against German and Italian forces in North Africa. Kelly's guns pounded enemy positions. The mission was completed successfully, and the flotilla returned to Malta. May 20th, 1941. This date marked the beginning of World War II's largest airborne operation. German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers landed on the island of Crete. This operation, codenamed Operation Mercury, was the largest airborne assault the world had ever seen. Crete was critical for control of the eastern Mediterranean. The island was defended by British, Australian, and New Zealand forces. Allied troops under General Bernard Freyberg put up fierce resistance against the German paratroopers. In the first days, the defense appeared successful. German paratroopers were suffering heavy casualties, but on May 21st, Malemi Airfield fell. The Germans now could fly reinforcements onto the island. The turning point had arrived. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commander of the British Mediterranean Fleet, faced a difficult decision: evacuate by sea or continue resisting until the very end. Finally, the decision was made. Reinforcements would be sent to Crete, the defense would be supported, and evacuation would be carried out if necessary. This is precisely where HMS Kelly and the 5th Destroyer Flotilla entered the stage. On the night of May 21, 1941, Kelly, Kashmir, and Kipling departed Malta. Their target was the northern coast of Crete. The mission was multifaceted: stop vessels carrying German reinforcements, bombard Malemi Airfield, and provide support to Allied forces. Mountbatten pushed his flotilla through the dark waters. During daylight, the Mediterranean was the Luftwaffe's hunting ground. Night offered a window of opportunity for destroyers, but this window was narrow. The mission had to be completed and the ships withdrawn to open sea before dawn. On May 22, 1941, new orders came from Admiral Cunningham. General Freyberg had planned a counterattack on Malemi Airfield. The New Zealand Brigade was preparing to retake the airfield. Kelly and Kashmir would enter Kinea Bay and bombard the airfield from the sea, putting German positions under fire.
That same night, Kipling experienced a steering malfunction. Mountbatten couldn't risk taking a disabled ship on such a dangerous mission. Kipling was ordered to withdraw westward. This decision would prove vital just hours later. Now only Kelly and Kashmir remained. The two destroyers pressed on toward the northern coast of Crete. May 23, 1941, dawn. Kelly and Kashmir were entering Kinea Bay. As the first rays of daylight appeared on the horizon, Lookout spotted a target, a large caique, a Greek fishing boat-type vessel, carrying German soldiers from the mainland to Crete. These vessels enabled German reinforcements to reach the island by sea. Each could carry dozens of soldiers, and now, directly in front of Kelly, was one packed with fully equipped German troops. Mountbatten didn't hesitate. Both destroyers opened fire. Shells tore through the caique's hull. German soldiers in full marching kit leaped into the water. Their heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition dragged them under. Within minutes, the caique sank. This was the brutal face of war, but Mountbatten and his men were here for a mission. Every Allied soldier defending Crete depended on stopping these vessels. Kelly and Kashmir continued deeper into the bay. Malemi Airfield was in range. The guns turned toward the target, and bombardment began. German positions came under fire. But the sun was rising, and with the sun came death. It was approaching 8 in the morning. Kelly and Kashmir had completed their mission and were withdrawing to open sea, but they had stayed too late. High above the crystal blue of the Mediterranean, dark shapes appeared. Junkers U-87 Stuka, one of the German Luftwaffe's most fearsome weapons. These dive bombers, with their screaming sirens and devastating accuracy, meant death for ships nearly defenseless at sea.
The first wave consisted of 24 Stukas. Yes, 24. Against 2 small destroyers, this many aircraft was a total annihilation operation. Alarms sounded. Crew rushed to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns swung skyward. Kelly and Kashmir began maneuvering at full speed. At sea, a ship's best defense was constantly changing direction to throw off the bomber's aim. The first dive began. The Stuka's characteristic siren wails filled the air like an infernal melody. Bombs fell into the water. Explosions sent columns of water shooting up around the ships. Kelly's anti-aircraft guns were spitting fire. Mountbatten was on the bridge giving orders. Engineers pushed for full power. The helm was constantly shifting. In the first minutes, both ships avoided being hit. Kelly's gunners even managed to shoot down one Stuka. They severely damaged another, which crashed while returning to base. But the Stukas wouldn't give up. Dive after dive, bomb after bomb. It was around 0800. A Stuka went into a steep dive at Kashmir. This time, a hit was unavoidable. A 1,000-pound bomb struck Kashmir dead center. The explosion was horrific. The ship was physically torn in two. The steel hull shattered like paper. Kashmir was sinking, and sinking fast. At that very moment, a hero emerged at Kashmir's weapons systems. Australian gunner Ian Rhodes refused to abandon his post even as his ship went down. He took aim at one of the returning Stukas and fired. The aircraft burst into flames and crashed into the sea. Rhodes' action would earn him the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. This medal was the second highest gallantry award that could be given in the British Commonwealth after the Victoria Cross. Ian Rhodes became the only Australian sailor to receive this medal in both world wars. Kashmir sank within 2 minutes. 80 sailors lost their lives. Survivors clung to life rafts in waters covered with fuel oil. Kelly was now alone. Mountbatten saw Kashmir go down, but there was no time to pause. The Stukas had now turned all their force on Kelly. Kelly was performing extraordinary maneuvers. Hard starboard, then hard port. The ship was turning nearly heeled over on her side. Bombs missed by inches. Mountbatten stood firm on the bridge, binoculars in hand, eyes on the sky. He gave commands for every dive, every bomb. The crew drew courage from their captain's composure. Kelly's anti-aircraft guns fired ceaselessly. Barrels glowed red from the heat. Ammunition carriers ran shells to the guns. The engine room was running at full power. 2 more Stukas were shot down, but the incoming aircraft kept coming. And then the inevitable happened. A bomb struck Kelly's port side, in the engine room area. The explosion tore through the ship. Kelly suddenly listed to port. But it didn't stop there. The ship began rolling uncontrollably. Speed and the sudden impact were spinning the hull. Mountbatten was still on the bridge, binoculars in hand, eyes on the sky. He gave commands for every dive, every bomb. The crew drew courage from their captain's composure.
Kelly's anti-aircraft guns fired ceaselessly. Barrels glowed red from the heat. Ammunition carriers ran shells to the guns. The engine room was running at full power. 2 more Stukas were shot down. But the incoming aircraft kept coming. And then the inevitable happened. A bomb struck Kelly's port side, in the engine room area. The explosion tore through the ship. Kelly suddenly listed to port. But it didn't stop there. The ship began rolling uncontrollably. Speed and the sudden impact were spinning the hull. Mountbatten was still on the bridge. The ship listed 60, 70, 80 degrees. She rolled almost completely over. And Mountbatten only left the bridge when the ship had fully capsized. The captain was the last man to leave his ship.
Kelly had capsized, but was still floating. Her keel was above water, propeller motionless. Surviving crew members had jumped into the sea. The Mediterranean waters were covered in fuel. Fuel oil leaking from Kashmir and Kelly had formed a thick layer on the surface. Men trying to swim struggled against this sticky liquid. And at that very moment, the Stukas returned. One of the war's most shameful moments unfolded. German pilots strafed the defenseless sailors struggling in the water. They made low passes and fired on those clinging to life rafts. This was a war crime, plain and simple. But in that moment, there was no court, no sanction, only the instinct to survive. Mountbatten was swimming in the water. His eyes burned from fuel, his lungs filled with a mixture of salt water and petroleum. His men were around him, some wounded, some exhausted. A petty officer seeing Mountbatten's surface remarked, "Funny how the scum always rises to the top, doesn't it, sir?" Even in the middle of battle, British humor held firm. Kelly floated upside down for about 30 minutes before she sank. 130 of her crew lost their lives. Together with 80 from Kashmir, the Mediterranean had swallowed 210 sailors that morning. The survivors remained in the water for 3.5 hours. Eyes sealed shut from fuel, bodies exhausted, morale shattered. Stuka attacks continued intermittently. And then, a silhouette appeared on the horizon. HMS Kipling. Yes, the Kipling that had been sent back due to the steering malfunction. The decision Mountbatten made that night was now saving hundreds of lives. Kipling's captain showed incredible courage. Stukas were still in the area. For a destroyer to stop was to become a perfect target, but Kipling stopped. Ropes were thrown, life rings were tossed, the wounded first, then the others. Mountbatten refused to leave the water until he was sure his men were safe. The captain, once again, was the last to come aboard. Kipling rescued 279 survivors from Kelly and Kashmir. The ship was packed. The decks were filled with wounded and exhausted sailors. But the danger wasn't over. The Stukas returned. Kipling raced toward Alexandria at full speed with the survivors. And throughout this journey, Mountbatten counted nearly 80 near misses. 80 bombs fell close to the ship but didn't hit. Kipling ran out of fuel 50 miles from Alexandria. HMS Protector caught up and transferred fuel. Finally, on the morning of May 24th, the survivors reached the Egyptian coast. The crews of Kelly and Kashmir came ashore at Alexandria. Exhausted, wounded, but alive. Mountbatten gathered his surviving men. He was going to give them a speech. This speech would go down in history. The captain standing before them had swum in the water with them, had returned from death with them. This man of aristocratic blood had fought like an ordinary sailor that day. Mountbatten began to speak. He spoke of the friends they had lost. He spoke of the courage they had shown, the discipline they had displayed. And then he said that famous line, "We didn't abandon Kelly, Kelly abandoned us." These words were the essence of centuries of British naval tradition. A sailor doesn't abandon his ship, but sometimes the ship must leave her sailors behind. The men wept. In the middle of the war, in the desert heat, exhausted beyond measure, these men couldn't hold back their tears. Mountbatten wept too. Then, Mountbatten shook each man's hand individually. 279 handshakes. He looked at each one, tried to say each one's name. He knew most of them. Kelly was a small ship, and Mountbatten was a captain who knew his crew. The survivors, after a few days' rest, were distributed to other ships. The war continued. There was no time for mourning. The loss of Kelly wasn't the end of Mountbatten's career. On the contrary, it was in some ways the beginning. Winston Churchill viewed Mountbatten's performance at Crete with admiration. Yes, the ship had been lost, but Mountbatten had fought to the last moment, commanded his men to the last moment, and gone into the water with them. This was leadership itself.
In the autumn of 1941, Mountbatten was appointed head of Combined Operations Command. In this role, he played a critical part in planning the invasion of Europe. Mountbatten's hand was in the planning stages of D-Day, the Normandy landings. In the following years, he became Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. He directed the war against the Japanese in Burma. At the war's end, he was one of the commanders who accepted the Japanese surrender at Singapore. After the war, he became the last Viceroy of India. He oversaw the independence process of the British Empire's most valuable colony. At the foundation of all these achievements lay the leadership he learned on Kelly, trusting his men, taking risks alongside them, never leaving them alone. Hebron, the town where Kelly was built, never forgot her ship. The workers at Hawthorne Leslie shipyard had built Kelly with their own hands. For them, Kelly wasn't just a warship, she was a source of pride. They had joyfully welcomed the ship's return with each repair. When Kelly sank, Hebron mourned. The shipyard workers felt as if they had lost one of their own family. Mountbatten never severed his connection with Hebron during and after the war. He wrote letters to the shipyard workers. He told them he would never forget their contribution to Kelly. A communal grave was made at Hebron Cemetery for the 20 crew members who lost their lives when Kelly was torpedoed off the Norwegian coast on May 9, 1940. The shipyard workers contributed to this memorial. Mountbatten would later write, "The bond between the men who build our ships and the men who fight in them and die in them has never been more strongly shown than in Kelly and in Hebron." Today, there's still a pub in Hebron called the Kelly. Pictures of the ship are displayed at the town's metro station. Kelly lives on in Hebron's collective memory. Kelly crew members who survived the war later founded an association, the HMS Kelly Association. This association regularly organized memorial meetings and reunions. Former sailors gathered with their families. They shared memories, remembered lost friends. Mountbatten was the honorary president of this association. He never severed his ties with the Kelly family until the end of his life. He attended meetings, chatted with his men. He enjoyed listening to their stories. Former crew members always referred to Mountbatten as the captain. Years passed, Mountbatten became an admiral, became a lord, became an advisor to world leaders. But to the Kelly sailors, he was always the captain. This bond lasted until 1979. That year, IRA terrorists planted a bomb on Mountbatten's boat near his summer home in Ireland. The explosion killed Mountbatten and 3 members of his family. For Kelly's surviving crew, this loss was even more painful than losing their ship. They had lost their captain once more, this time forever. Kelly's story reached not Hollywood, but British cinema before the war even ended. Noel Coward was one of the most famous British artists of the era. Playwright, actor, singer, composer, a multi-talented genius, and a close friend of Mountbatten's. In the summer of 1941, when Mountbatten returned to London, he had dinner with Coward. He told the story of Kelly, the final battle at Crete, the sinking, the hours in the water, the speech he gave to his men. Coward fell in love with this story. He immediately decided to make a film. But it wouldn't be easy. The Naval Command wasn't enthusiastic about a film depicting the sinking of a British warship. The Ministry of Information was also concerned. Would such a film damage public morale? Mountbatten intervened. He met with the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound. He persuaded Minister of Information Brendan Bracken. Finally, permissions were granted. In Which We Serve was filmed in 1942. Coward was screenwriter, director, and lead actor. The character of Captain Kinross was clearly inspired by Mountbatten. The film's assistant director was a young name, David Lean. Yes, that David Lean, who would later create masterpieces like Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. In Which We Serve was his first directing experience. The film was a great success. It broke box office records in Britain. It was also shown in America and received warmly. At the 1943 Academy Awards, it was nominated for Best Picture. Coward won a special Oscar for Outstanding Production Achievement. In the film's finale, Captain Kinross's speech to his surviving crew was taken from Mountbatten's actual speech at Alexandria, word for word. The story of HMS Kelly isn't just the story of a warship. This story shows what leadership means. Mountbatten came from an aristocratic family. If he'd wanted, he could have watched the war from a safe headquarters behind a desk. But he stood on his ship's bridge. He faced mine explosions, torpedo hits, and bomb storms alongside his men. This story shows the power of teamwork. Kelly's crew held on to each other through every disaster. Shipyard workers repaired the ship, engineers pumped water, gunners fired. Everyone did their part. This story shows what it means to never give up. How many times should Kelly have sunk? After the mine, after the collision, after the torpedo? She could have gone down any of those times, but each time she held on. And most importantly, this story shows that hope can exist even in humanity's darkest hours. Those men floating in the water, even while being strafed by Stukas, didn't lose hope. Kipling came and saved them.
If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The story of HMS Kelly will be completed in the third and final part. In that episode, I'll tell you about Kelly's place in British naval history, post-war memorial ceremonies, and how this legendary ship is remembered today. I also have a surprise for you. In the final part, I'll talk about another little-known but incredible story from World War II. I'll reveal the topic of the next video series in the finale of Kelly's story. If you don't want to be left wondering, don't forget to turn on notifications. See you in the final part. In the first two parts, I told you the incredible story of HMS Kelly, a ship that struck mines, was hit by torpedoes, was torn apart by bombs, yet managed to stay afloat every single time. And finally, on May 23, 1941, off the coast of Crete, under the relentless attack of 24 Stukas, a legend was buried in the depths of the Mediterranean. But a ship's story doesn't end the moment she sinks. True legends continue to live on even after their physical existence is gone. HMS Kelly became exactly that kind of legend. Today, in the final part of this series, I'll tell you what happened after Kelly sank, the mark this ship left on British and American societies, and why she's still talked about more than 80 years later. If you're ready, let's begin the final act of our story. May 23, 1941, the day Kelly sank, was only the middle of the Battle of Crete. Allied forces were still resisting, but the balance had shifted in Germany's favor. News of the loss of Kelly and Kashmir sent shock waves through the Mediterranean fleet, but Admiral Cunningham didn't withdraw his ships. On the contrary, he continued risking his vessels to defend Crete and evacuate troops when necessary. On May 27th, the decision to evacuate was made. Thousands of British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers were loaded onto ships from Crete's southern shores. Throughout this operation, the Royal Navy suffered heavy losses. Cruisers sank, destroyers were damaged, but the soldiers were saved. By June 1st, more than 18,000 Allied soldiers had been evacuated from Crete. This was one of the largest naval evacuations of the war since Dunkirk. The sacrifice of Kelly and Kashmir was a small part of this larger picture. Crete eventually fell, but the Germans paid a heavy price too. Paratrooper casualties were so high that Hitler never again ordered an airborne operation on this scale. Crete had become the graveyard of German paratroopers. The 279 sailors who survived Kelly and Kashmir returned to duty after a brief rest period in Alexandria. War was merciless, and there was no time for mourning. Most of these men served on different ships for the remainder of the war. Some fought against U-boats in Atlantic convoys. Some were sent to the Pacific and fought against the Japanese. Some experienced more losses. In an interesting coincidence, HMS Kipling, the ship that rescued Kelly's survivors, was sunk by German aircraft off Tobruk just 1 year later in May 1942. The ship that saved Kelly had met the same fate. But most of the survivors made it through the war. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the former Kelly sailors returned home. They reunited with their families and tried to continue their normal lives. But they never forgot Kelly. They could never forget. Immediately after the war, a bond began forming among the former Kelly crew. These men had been through hell together. Such an experience binds people for life. In the late 1940s, informal gatherings began. Former sailors met at pubs. They shared memories, remembered lost friends. Over time, these gatherings became regular events. The HMS Kelly Association was officially founded. The association organized annual meetings.
May 9th was the day to remember the 20 sailors lost when she was torpedoed off Norway. May 23rd was the day to remember the 130 who lost their lives at Crete.
Families also attended these meetings. Wives, children, grandchildren of the fallen sailors. The Kelly family kept growing. Though not bound by blood, the bond created by a shared past was stronger than anything. Mountbatten, as honorary president of the association, made it a point to attend every meeting. He had become an admiral, a lord. He met with the world's most powerful people, but at Kelly gatherings, he was still the captain. He joked with his former sailors, listened to their stories, met their families. This loyalty was precious to both sides. The sailors knew their captain hadn't forgotten them, and Mountbatten never forgot that he had learned what true leadership meant on Kelly. Hebburn, the town where Kelly was built, had developed a special bond with its ship. The workers at Hawthorne Leslie Shipyard had created Kelly with their own hands. Every rivet, every steel plate was their labor. Throughout the war, whenever Kelly was damaged, she returned to the Hebburn shipyard. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say the workers rebuilt her 3 times. Each time, they made her stronger, more resilient. When Kelly sank, Hebburn mourned. For the shipyard workers, this wasn't just the loss of a warship. It was the destruction of something they had created, the labor of their own hands. But Hebburn never forgot Kelly. A pub in the town center took the name The Kelly. For decades, this pub was a meeting point for former sailors and shipyard workers. Photos of the ship and pictures of the crew hung on the walls. When the Metro line came to Hebburn in the 1970s, the station was decorated with a Kelly theme. Murals, panels telling the ship's story. Even today, anyone entering Hebburn Metro Station sees the town's most famous creation. In Hebburn Cemetery, there is a communal memorial for the 20 Kelly sailors who lost their lives off the Norwegian coast. Every year on May 9th, a ceremony is held there. The grandchildren of shipyard workers stand alongside the grandchildren of sailors. This bond transcended class divisions. The workers who built the ships and the sailors who fought in them shared a common pride. Mountbatten expressed it this way: "The bond between the men who build our ships and the men who fight in them and die in them has never been more strongly shown than in Kelly and in Hebburn." In Which We Serve, released in 1942, brought Kelly's story to millions. Noel Coward's masterpiece became one of the most effective propaganda films of the war era. The film was also groundbreaking technically. David Lean's work as assistant director was the beginning of a career that would change cinema history. Lean would later use what he learned on this film in masterpieces like The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia, and Dr. Zhivago. But the film's real power was in the story it told. The fictional HMS Torrin and Captain Kinross were actually Kelly and Mountbatten. Everyone knew it. The film told of a ship and crew's sacrifice, of ordinary people showing extraordinary courage under extreme circumstances. The film's finale was taken from Mountbatten's actual speech at Alexandria. The words Captain Kinross spoke to his surviving crew were compiled from Mountbatten's letters to Kelly families and his speeches. The film achieved great box office success in Britain. It was also shown in America and became one of the most beloved films of the war era. At the 1943 Oscars, it was nominated for Best Picture. Coward won a Special Academy Award for Outstanding Production Achievement. Thanks to this film, Kelly's story was passed on to generations that hadn't directly experienced the war. Mothers showed their children, teachers showed their students this film. Kelly became part of the collective memory. After the loss of Kelly, Mountbatten's career rose rapidly. Churchill appointed him head of Combined Operations Command. In this role, Mountbatten played a critical part in planning the Dieppe raid and eventually D-Day. In 1943, he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. He directed the campaign against the Japanese in Burma. At war end, he accepted the surrender of Japanese forces at Singapore.
After the war, he became the last Viceroy of India. He oversaw the independence process of the British Empire's most valuable colony.
Though controversial, this role was one of history's greatest political transitions. In his retirement years, Mountbatten wrote his memoirs and took on various ceremonial duties, but no matter how busy he was, he never missed Kelly meetings. His former sailors visited him, he visited them, letters were written, phone calls were made. Mountbatten continued to be part of the Kelly family. On August 27, 1979, the IRA planted a bomb on Mountbatten's fishing boat. In the explosion off the coast of Sligo, Ireland, Mountbatten, his grandson, and a family friend lost their lives. The news shook the world. A member of the royal family had been killed by terrorists. But among those most deeply affected were Kelly's surviving crew. These men were now old. The vigorous sailors in their 20s, 30s, and 40s had become retirees in their 70s and 80s. But Mountbatten's death took them back to 1941, to the bloody waters of Crete, to the shadow of the Stukas, to the moment their captain said, "We didn't abandon Kelly. Kelly abandoned us." They had lost their captain once more, this time forever. The HMS Kelly Association gained distinguished supporters over the years. Chief among them was the British royal family, close relatives of Mountbatten. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, became one of the association's most important supporters. Charles regarded Mountbatten as an honorary grandfather. The bond between them was very strong. Mountbatten's death had deeply affected Charles. Charles attended Kelly memorial ceremonies. He supported the association's events. He met with former sailors and listened to their stories. This support increased the association's prestige and contributed to keeping Kelly's story alive. Actor Sir John Mills was also an important supporter of the association. Mills had played the character Shorty Blake in Which We Serve. The film had been one of the turning points of his career. Mills maintained his Kelly connection until the end of his life and attended memorial events. Time is merciless. The young sailors who were in their 20s in 1941 grew old over the years and left us one by one. Each year, the number of people attending Kelly reunions decreased. The dozens of participants in the 1990s dropped to tens in the 2000s and could be counted on fingers by the 2010s. In recent years, the last surviving members of Kelly's crew have passed away. One of them was a sailor who, while battling dementia at 97, still held a wooden cross commemorating Kelly in his room. Even if his memory was erased, his connection to Kelly was not. These men were living witnesses to history. With their passing, no one with direct experience remains, but the story didn't die. Families told their children and grandchildren Kelly's story. The association digitized its archives. Documents, photographs, letters were preserved. Kelly's legacy was secured to be passed on to future generations. In 2021, the 80th anniversary of Kelly's sinking was commemorated. The Royal Navy published a special page dedicated to Kelly on its official website. The story was told once more. The mines, the torpedoes, the bombs, and a crew that never gave up. A ceremony was held in Hebburn. The shipyard was gone. Hawthorne Leslie had long since closed. But the townspeople gathered. Glasses were raised at the pub bearing Kelly's name. The images at the metro station were adorned with flowers. Kelly's story spread across the internet. Documentaries on YouTube, narratives on podcasts, articles on blogs. A new generation is learning this story through digital channels. Model ship enthusiasts build Kelly replicas. Kelly appears as a character in video games. Kelly is discussed in history forums. A ship sank 80 years ago, but its impact continues. What can we learn from the story of HMS Kelly? First, the power of leadership. Mountbatten wasn't a perfect person. Critics debate his mistakes, his ego, his political ambitions at length, but no one questions his leadership capacity. Mountbatten stood by his men. He took risks alongside them. When the ship sank, he was the last to leave. In Alexandria, he shook each man's hand. This is true leadership.
Second, the importance of team spirit. Kelly's crew was more than the sum of individual parts. They worked like an organism. Engineers pumped water, gunners fired, medics tended to the wounded. Everyone did their part. This coordination saved Kelly time and again. Third, the value of resilience. Kelly was a ship that should have sunk. After the mine, after the collision, after the torpedo. Technically, she should have been finished each time. But she wasn't. The quality workmanship of the shipyard workers, the determination of the crew, the composure of the captain. When all these came together, the impossible became possible. Fourth, the importance of remembering. Kelly's crew never forgot their lost friends. Even years later, they held memorial ceremonies, told stories, kept memories alive. This loyalty is one of humanity's finest qualities. Remembering the fallen, giving meaning to their lives, is the responsibility of the living. This story is primarily an epic of British heroism, but it contains important lessons for American audiences as well. World War II was an era when British and American soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder. When Kelly sank, America had not yet entered the war, but a few months later Pearl Harbor would happen, and American soldiers would go to the front in Europe and the Pacific. American sailors also faced challenges like Kelly's crew, USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Samuel B. Roberts, the small American destroyers that stood against giant Japanese warships at Leyte Gulf carried the same spirit as Kelly. Courage, sacrifice, team spirit, these values are universal. The flag changes, the uniform changes, but risking your life for your comrade in the middle of battle means the same everywhere. Kelly's story is a source of inspiration for audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, because this story shows humanity's best qualities regardless of nationality. HMS Kelly was a steel structure 356 feet long, displacing 2,330 tons, 6 guns, 10 torpedo tubes, approximately 220 crew. Technically, she was a standard destroyer of her era. But Kelly took on meaning far beyond her technical specifications. Kelly became a symbol of never giving up, of staying standing, of continuing to fight despite everything. In Britain's darkest days, a mirror reflecting the spirit of the island nation. Kelly became a family. Mountbatten and his crew became brothers without blood ties. Shipyard workers became close to sailors. The families of the fallen became the family of the survivors. This bond lasted for decades. Kelly became a legacy. Films, books, documentaries, memorial ceremonies, the story was passed from generation to generation. Today, people not born in 1941 know and tell Kelly's story. And perhaps most importantly, Kelly became a reminder. A symbol reminding us of the true cost of war, the price of freedom, what courage means. At the bottom of the Mediterranean, north of Crete, Kelly still lies. Her steel hull has long since rusted, her guns are silent, her engines stopped. But above, on land, in people's hearts and memories, Kelly lives on. Because true legends never die. Thank you for watching the story of HMS Kelly. I hope this 3-part series has given you both historical knowledge and inspiration. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, you can tell me which World War II stories you'd like to hear. And as I promised, I'm announcing the topic of our next series. In my next video, I'll tell you about one of World War II's most mysterious and little-known operations. In the icy fjords of Norway, a handful of British commandos were sent on an impossible mission to stop Nazi Germany's nuclear weapons program. Heavy water sabotage, a night raid that changed the course of history, and brave men whose heroism almost no one knows about. This story is as thrilling as Kelly's story,
perhaps even more dramatic. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.